G'day everyone and welcome back. Now before I go ahead with this one, I want to remind you all that due to the fog of war and a lack of transparency from Russian sources for obvious reasons, we're going to be relying on information provided by the state agencies of both parties and OSINT sources, meaning that there will be a decent amount of speculation. I very much doubt the Russian Ministry of Defense will give me their operational readiness reports, especially for long-range aviation command, no matter how nicely I ask. Nevertheless, as the air war is my field, as it were, I'm going to weigh in with what I hope will be a succinct report on what's going on with Russia's switch to traditional strategic bombing, why they've switched to it, and how it's going, and of course what I think the end result will be. Now, for those of you who have watched my friend Perrin's video, by necessity we're going to be covering a lot of the same thing, but I'm going to try and give a bit more of an insight into the technical, tactical, and operational side of things, along with a bit of a historical focus. But, of course, if you want geopolitical and logistics, I highly recommend watching his video if you haven't after watching this one. Link below. But first, of course, I am a YouTuber and I need to pay the bills, so you know what time it is. It gives me great pleasure to say that this video is sponsored by Atlas VPN, and right now, Atlas VPN is running an insane Christmas deal. Now you can get Atlas VPN Premium for just $1.70 per month, plus 6 months extra with a 30-day money-back guarantee. It's the best Atlas VPN offer of the year, so be quick and get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below, and the pinned comment. But, suppose you need more convincing. VPNs are the first line of defense when browsing online, and Atlas VPN has a big focus on your security. It blocks ads, malware, malicious links, and trackers while notifying you when someone tries to steal your data. It keeps your Google searches private and untracked, ensuring you surf the net safely. And with just one subscription, you can protect all of your devices. Combine that with today's special offer and you simply have the best VPN deal on the market right now, and those savings don't stop there. By changing server locations and hunting around, Atlas gives you the opportunity to get the best deals from all over the world. Plus, this location changing feature lets you access geo-locked content on all your favorite services like Netflix. And trust me, as an Australian and an anime fan, this right here is the biggest factor for me. So go out and get Atlas VPN Premium for just $1.70 a month plus 6 months extra with a 30-day money-back guarantee. As I said before, it's Atlas VPN's best offer of the year, so get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below. Right now, get it. Go get it. It's great. Anyway, thank you for the sponsor. On to the video. Alrighty, strategic bombing, a topic that is not at all controversial or debatable. It just happens to be the single most contentious discussion point in the history of aerial warfare since its codification during World War I, both in its military utility and its morality. The comments on this video are going to be fun. So, with that in mind, let's start from square one. What is strategic bombing? Strategic bombing is the utilization of air power against strategic targets. Incredible professional insight, I know. Those strategic targets being defined as targets which form the indirect, or rather the long-term, logistical framework for a nation's warfighting potential. Their infrastructure, production facilities, communication centers, and of course, the well-being or morale of the civilian population. These targets are distinct from interdiction targets and tactical targets, which are defined by being the direct means a country wages a war. Military transport, military installations, entrenched troops, ammunition depots, etc., etc. Thus, a country pursues strategic bombing as part of a larger overall operational concept to weaken the enemy in the long term by destroying their ability to sustain combat operations, rather than destroying the enemy in direct combat. Now, to win a war, you need to do both of these things. But, to quote the artisan of warfare himself, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. If you defeat the enemy's strategic ability to wage a war, it doesn't matter how good his military is, you will eventually defeat him. Exhibit A. It didn't matter how well armoured their panzers were, it didn't matter how fast their jets were, it didn't matter that they had assault rifles, long-range missiles, night vision, or what have you. They had almost no fuel, their industrial base got blown up, they had no access to global trade, and they were outnumbered by the largest military-industrial alliance in human history. Point is, you can have as many soldiers as you like, hell, you can have as many super weapons as you like. If you can't feed them, clothe them, arm and equip them, all you have is a very expensive, unreliable, and disconcertingly depressed wall, codename Meat Shield. You don't have an army. And rather inconveniently, the bricks of that wall all have silly things like families, who are probably the factory workers getting bombed to oblivion in order to ruin the aforementioned economy. So they aren't likely to approve of this plan either. meaning ultimately that in order to save the lives of the people, as well as your own lives from those very same people who are angry about you getting them bombed, you capitulate or seek terms. Now, what I've just done is explain the theory of strategic bombing to you as envisioned by its proponents in the interwar period, people like Sir Hugh Trenchard, or his more famous and successful acolyte, Sir Arthur bankrupting German life insurance since 1944 Harris. But despite me using the spicy pinwheel gang as the example for why strategic success ultimately defeats tactical success, they also stand as an example of why strategic bombing is such a complex topic in terms of military operations. Because when it came down to carrying out the world's first major concerted strategic bombing campaign against the Reich, there were so many variables, so many aspects to its multitudes of successes and failures, so many debated and contested data points that ultimately military theorists and historians alike are still bitterly divided on the efficacy of strategic bombing militarily, economically, and socially. Some are staunch advocates, others say it's useless, and then there are the people in between. Hi, I'm the in-between. But you aren't here for a video about the combined bomber offensive, though I kinda wish you were, because that's an awesome video to make. I want to make that one. But no, you are here for the war in Ukraine. So let's talk about the war in Ukraine. Now, despite the incessant refrain from vatniks and bots across social media's varying comment sections, I feel like I am pretty safe in saying that this war is an unmitigated disaster from Russia's point of view. At time of writing, Russia has achieved only one of its objectives since the commencement of hostilities in February, that objective being the establishing of a direct land connection to the Crimean Peninsula via the occupation of southern Ukraine. Although, if you wanted to be technical, considering that Wagner PMC is currently getting systematically murdered in the meat grinder around Bakhmut, Putin is steadily accomplishing his denazification objective, albeit not in the way he originally intended. The Kharkiv counteroffensive and the disastrous defeat at Kherson has left the Russians stuck on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, with no major cities under their control, an exceedingly hostile local population providing real-time on-the-ground intelligence to their enemies, and a logistics system which could best be described as theoretically optimistic. We've seen frontline troops being issued with weapons and equipment from the 1950s, sometimes even older than that. We've had videos of Russian troops looting everything not nailed down and essentially foraging to eat, while newly mobilized conscripts are complaining about lack of training, lack of equipment, guns that literally break apart from rust, and, of course, I found this, an issued air rifle. Yes, you heard correctly. One poor bloke was sent out there with an air rifle. And it doesn't stop there. Their food situation is equally perilous. Boxes full of expired MREs, combined with just a general lack of food all over the force, and increasing reports of dwindling medical supplies as well. It also doesn't help that Ukrainian artillery and resistance fighters keep blowing up their depots and their supply convoys once they actually get the stuff in the country. Not to mention the small problem of it being an absolute complete lottery whether or not they still have bridges across the myriad of waterways throughout the eastern Ukrainian plain, courtesy of HIMARS. With all of these factors considered, alongside the incredible tenacity of the Ukrainians, it's pretty clear that unless something truly catastrophic befalls the defenders, like, I don't know, Zelensky and his high command spontaneously combusting, or America being transported to another world with their military-industrial complex, courtesy of an oversized truck, or I don't know, maybe even Putin being replaced by Yuri from Red Alert 2.
No tricks, Mr. President. In a few moments, I will unleash a tidal wave of psychic energy designed to dominate the minds of an entire planet. There will be no more free will, only my will.
Without one of these things happening, the Russian armed forces' capability to defeat Ukraine's army in the field is exceedingly doubtful, especially given that the battlefield initiative has been in Ukraine's hands for the past 6 months. Their withdrawal from Kherson shows that they can't support large numbers of forces in forward positions, especially across natural barriers. For them to retake territory west of the Dnieper, for example, they'd have to conduct a river assault in force with at least 2 Class A divisions at nominal strength across one of the widest rivers in Europe, while maintaining both artillery and air supremacy in the battle space around the crossing point, and they would need to maintain that supremacy 24/7 to keep the bridges they need, which they'll have to build themselves, by the way, intact and able to support the large number of units in the bridgehead. And all of this while dealing with the previously outlined logistical and operational cluster fornication that they are currently faced with. I don't think you need to be a Staff College trained officer or to have read Sun Tzu and Clausewitz to take one look at this situation and go, no, that's not happening. The Russians aren't going to be able to regain the initiative. However, that said, the same problems caused by the size of the battle area and the difficult terrain also applies to the Ukrainians. Now, while we in the West would like to think they'll regroup, reorganize, and then launch a valiant offensive to retake Crimea in one fell swoop, the fact is, while they have better logistics, thank you NATO, and a large number of highly motivated troops, the Ukrainians don't have the artillery, air power, or armor to carry out that mission either. And so, as some commentators have aptly put it, what we have is a modern-day World War I, trenches upon trenches with very static front lines. The high lethality of the weapons on both sides preventing any movement at all. The only major exception being the Battle of Bakhmut, which is very reminiscent of Stalingrad. Desperate close-range, small-unit actions among the ubiquitous commie-block apartments found throughout Eastern Europe. It really is hell in that city, as some of the footage here shows. But it's this that forms the first part of why the Russians have chosen to initiate a dedicated strategic bombing campaign now of all times. For the simple reason that it's their only real option to put Ukraine on the back foot and undermine their ability to make war. They have no way of retaking the initiative in the field, tactically or operationally, which means it's down to strategic warfare, naval blockade, geopolitical maneuver, and the application of socio-economic pressure on the Ukrainian state and its people. And given that the Ukrainians have pushed the front lines far away from their industrial and economic centre, well out of artillery range, the Russians have only one real way to achieve that pressure: strategic bombing. Now, to achieve that, the Russians have three methods of conducting their strategic bombing campaign with the weapons they have to hand. First is the Black Sea Fleet, with surface-launched cruise missiles from their three missile frigates, along with their flotilla of smaller guided missile corvettes. These are armed with the largest stockpiles of accurate surface-to-surface weapon systems with the best turnaround time frame. Given that in a maximum effort strike, they can deliver a considerable number of missiles relatively quickly from well outside the range of Ukrainian coastal defences. And operating as a squadron, they can stay on station delivering multiple strikes over a longer time frame, at which point they can then rotate into their main fleet base Sevastopol and rearm from fleet munition storage, which, since the Soviet era, has had huge reserves of various ordnance. Though, as Moskva's sinking demonstrates, their biggest issue is most likely maintenance cycles. And if you're looking for a theme here, you aren't going to see a more recurring one than that. Across the entire Russian military, no less. Next, you have theater ballistic missiles, TBMs. Now, TBMs are different from cruise missiles as they do not fly like aircraft at a programmed subsonic speed and heading. They are instead fired ballistically. Again, nothing but professional insight here. They climb to extreme altitude and then dive in on the target at very high speed, making them essentially impossible to intercept. The Iskander-M TBM is the primary type in use by the Russian rocket forces. However, while it falls into this class of weapon for simplicity's sake, it is in fact a fully guided weapon system from launch to impact. It has its own defensive countermeasures and travels at Mach 7. It's also nuclear capable and a unicorn. And the reason it's a unicorn is because it's an actual functioning Russian precision weapon system. Incredible, I know. And it is the scariest conventional weapon the Russians can employ. However, as you can imagine, with all this capability, it is also very expensive, something which the Russians are not able to use liberally as more modern armies can. As such, they are used as precision ordnance to take out high-value targets. They saw extensive use in the initial stages of the war in an attempt to destroy Ukraine's command and control network, along with their integrated air defense. But their prolific use has resulted in the expenditure of most of their frontline issue missiles. It's assumed they have a reserve in case a high-value target presents itself, or the blockbuster movie Article 5 Freedom Overdrive hits theaters in Moscow, so they haven't been used very often in the current campaign. Then again, the Russian Armed Forces has requested production to be resumed for both the Iskander-M and the Tochka-U, so they will be steadily regrouping and recouping their expenditure. Though production figures have been estimated, with the microchip shortage, sanctions, and unit cost, to be around 2 to 6 missiles per month, so not exactly great. Thus, the majority of the theater ballistic missiles we've seen in recent times have been from their reserves of their older Tochka series of missiles. The same type that Ukraine fields, in fact. However, as one can imagine, it's an old missile from the 1970s, and thus it's nowhere near as accurate as modern weapons, nor does it have the range. It does get through air defenses though, and it makes a nasty mess when it does hit something, such as a train station full of refugees, for example. They've seen deployment against large targets such as air bases, factory complexes, large government buildings, etc., with sporadic results. No, the true second arm to the strategic bombing offensive and its most publicly seen face is of course Russian long-range aviation, formerly 37th Air Army, comprised of the 22nd Guards Heavy Aviation Division and the 326th Heavy Bomber Division. They operate 66 Tu-22M Backfires, 15 Tu-160 White Swans, and 42 Tu-95 Bears, or at least that was their strength prior to February 2022. Between them, they are the primary deployment method for the extensive family of Soviet-era air-to-surface cruise missiles, as well as the dedicated standoff weapons developed by Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. I've made 2 whole videos about these aircraft and their capabilities on my channel, so if you need to know more, hit that subscribe button and check them out later. But for our purposes, it's really easy and really simple to follow. You climb high, you get in range, which is really far away because they're standoff weapons, you confirm target acquisition, you yeet the missiles, and fly back home. However, what really matters is, of course, what they are yeeting their missiles at, which is the core discussion of this video, because it has changed and evolved throughout the conflict. The current shift to traditional strategic bombing is just the latest phase of their air campaign, so let's go through it. Russian long-range strikes were, as mentioned before, initially focused on the Ukrainian air defenses and their overall command and control apparatus. This corresponded with the highest expenditure of standoff weapons from both naval and air forces. They burned through weapons at a remarkable rate. However, while their intelligence on Ukrainian air defenses was good, they did not have true strategic and tactical surprise, meaning that most of the ground-based air defenses and Ukrainian Air Force aircraft were dispersed and constantly mobile, meaning they burned through a lot of expensive ammunition for very little effect. This was a problem across the entire Russian armed forces, as they had trouble getting up-to-date targeting information for their support fires, and even when they did, the accuracy of their weapons, due to the inefficiency of GLONASS, training deficiencies, and the general inferiority of Russian weapon systems in high-technology areas, rendered their effectiveness rather dubious. The exceptions were, of course, the modern Caliber and Iskander systems, which the Russians would end up relying on during the initial phase of the campaign very, very heavily, depleting their stocks rapidly. However, as we know, the Russian army was stopped cold around Kyiv, while the Ukrainians managed to crawl back into the fight, eventually forcing the Russians to withdraw from the Kyiv and Kharkiv axes. With the failure of the initial operations against the air defense network, combined with a sporadic and hence ineffective electronic warfare and seed campaign, the Ukrainians managed to reorganize and deploy its integrated air defense very successfully, meaning Russia was denied air superiority in the battle space, with Ukrainian territory being impassable to Russian aircraft, both rotary and fixed-wing, at all altitudes past the forward edge of the battle area. Furthermore, both technical and human intelligence had been degraded significantly as tighter security protocols were enforced by the Ukrainians, along with unconfirmed but probable NATO electronic warfare and counterintelligence support. This forced a change in target priorities for the Russians to fixed targets: rail yards, bridges, oil tank farms, factories, munitions plants, known military facilities, and general infrastructure targets directly related to the war effort. But by now the Ukrainians had reorganized their air defense to prioritize their S-300 systems around urban centers, while forward deploying their SA-11s and SA-8s to cover the front lines. They also reorganized into self-contained air defense zones, able to locate and engage a target independently, improving response time. Because cruise missiles and older ballistic missiles are fired at extreme range and generally follow a constant course and speed, the S-300s, having been designed for long-range airspace denial, excelled in dealing with the incoming threats, averaging a 60% interception rate against all missiles fired into Ukrainian territory, meaning that the number of targets hit and the concentration of fire against those targets was insufficient to do any amount of significant damage. The Ukrainian rail network, as well as the main Ukranoprom facilities, kept operating at near nominal efficiency, with any serious damage being repaired within a very short time span, sometimes within hours. By June, the campaign had resulted in troublesome but ultimately ineffectual damage and disruption to the Ukrainian war effort, both economically and militarily, while simultaneously having a detrimental effect on Russian strike capability. As stated earlier, they had expended a huge amount of their precision standoff munitions in their initial campaign and throughout the first few months, while achieving relatively little, resulting in the remaining number of these munitions being held back in their strategic reserve, while new missiles could be manufactured. Problem is, of course, when your country is essentially internationally embargoed, getting the materials and technology you need to make these advanced weapon systems is really difficult. Fun fact, the microchips and computer components in most of their advanced weapons are Western-made. Well, mostly Western. A considerable number of their electronics and tech imports are imported from Taiwan, East China Island with Taipei on it? What are we supposed to call it now? Anyway, so they had to get creative in meeting their operational needs to maintain their standoff capability. So what did they do? Well, they took missiles originally designed for different missions and retrofitted them to augment their dedicated cruise missile arsenal. The primary source of these conversions was, of course, anti-ship missiles, as they have the most commonality with the cruise missile mission, specifically longer ranges and larger warheads. However, due to the different target types and mission profiles, even with the required alterations, their accuracy suffered considerably. As they're not hitting ships, they're hitting ground targets, which have a lot more clutter and a lot more different things around them that will cause trouble for their targeting sensors. But it did not stop there. The S-300 series of SAM has a land attack capability for emergencies if enemy ground units are pushing up on their position. The missile itself has a large high-explosive payload and a fragmentary casing for destroying aircraft, so it's very effective against infantry and light vehicles. Problem is, the missiles rely on radar guidance, and you can't track ground targets. So the S-300 fires its missiles ballistically unguided, making them exceedingly inaccurate. Hence, they get used in a similar role to the Grad or the Smerch, long-range saturation bombing against soft targets and personnel. These measures helped maintain the momentum of the cruise missile offensive, however, expenditure remained a serious problem. Of all the missiles fired, less than a quarter were capable of precision targeting, and on average, at least half of the missiles launched were successfully intercepted by the Ukrainian air defense. Russia needed a solution, which it found in the Iranian Shahed 136 loitering munition. Loitering munitions, for those unaware, are small UAVs, which are themselves the weapon delivery system, hence their nickname, kamikaze drones. Their warhead is generally very small, and their overall performance is limited in terms of speed and range, but the trade-off is that these munitions are often far more accurate than even precision strikes conducted by aircraft. However, Iran's design is actually rather innovative and provides Russia with a very useful capability. While it can be outfitted to perform the aforementioned role if you want to pay the much higher price tag, the Shahed 136 is not a terminally guided loitering munition. That is, it's not flown by an operator into a target. Rather, it is a GPS-guided standoff munition fired in large waves, with the goal of overwhelming local air defenses and swarming a fixed target. The lack of terminal guidance means you don't have the kind of precise control of other weapons, but the lack of sensors and control gear means it's much lighter. Combine that with its considerable sized engine and wingspan, which is optimized in a flying wing shape, and you get excellent range, estimated to be in excess of 1,600 kilometers or over 1,000 miles, while carrying a 30 kilo or 60 pound payload, essentially making them miniature GPS-guided cruise missiles, though their speed is much lower due to the fact that it's a prop-driven design, topping out at around 170 to 180 kilometers an hour, which likewise impacts their operational altitude, which is not very high, at least under 10,000 feet. Now, this is a problem, because if you are flying at low altitude and at slower speeds, you are an easy target for every SAM system Ukraine has. In fact, almost all of these drones are shot down by Ukrainian manpads teams long before they reach their targets. But unlike cruise or theater ballistic weapons, these are mass-produced in both Russia and Iran from cheap components and launched in massive waves. So when the Russians deploy them alongside their main weapons, the Ukrainians have double the number of targets to worry about, improving the odds for their main strike weapons to get through. Nevertheless, as stated earlier, their campaign against the command, communications and logistics infrastructure of the Ukrainian war effort proved once again to be ineffective. The Russians just weren't able to concentrate enough firepower on critical targets, nor were their weapons accurate enough to inflict decisive damage, with both problems being heavily exacerbated by the inability to get enough missiles through the Ukrainian integrated air defense system, even after augmenting their forces with drones and retrofitted anti-ship weapons. And those reserves, too, were starting to deplete faster than the Russians were anticipating. They once again needed to change their angle, which brings us up to the present and the latest phase of the strategic bombing campaign. In early October, orders went out to the various Russian frontline air defense units that a sustained cruise missile offensive would commence within the near future, so they needed to positively ID their targets. Sure enough, on October 10th at 11 a.m. local time, 83 cruise missiles, both naval and air-launched, in conjunction with a wave of Shahed 136 drones, struck energy infrastructure throughout Ukraine. Around 30% of the Ukrainian power grid was hit in some way, even with the Ukrainians successfully downing half the incoming threats. Sadly, due to the degraded accuracy of the older Russian weapon systems, a considerable number of the missiles missed their targets and hit civilians, including a playground and a kindergarten, because regardless of changes in strategy, the Russians have to stay on brand. But another major shift was a difference in operational tempo. Instead of a constant sustained offensive, they switched to concentrated strikes roughly once a week, supported by small-scale harassment operations with indirect ground fire closer to frontline regions on the off days. This allows for a much higher volume of missiles per target and better maintenance cycles for their units on the days when they do launch strikes. October 17th saw the next attack, then October the 22nd, then the 31st. Moving on into November on the 15th, the 17th, and the 23rd, consistently striking the Ukrainian power grid and, more sinisterly, the Ukrainian water service infrastructure, pumping stations and water treatment plants. And again, while most incoming weapons were intercepted and destroyed, enough got through to disrupt access to power and clean water consistently throughout most major cities. Bringing it forward to today, these attacks are still occurring on the current schedule. A major attack roughly once a week, once every 2 weeks, of about 100 missiles, with the Russian target folders mainly concentrating on the power grid, water infrastructure, and energy sources, that being fuel and natural gas. Civilian casualties have spiked from both the missiles themselves and the knock-on effects from lack of access to necessities, mainly among children and the elderly. The Russian focus on the power grid, energy reserves and water supplies of Ukraine marks a fundamental shift in their objectives, and it also indicates the current military situation of the Russian armed forces. The attacks carried out through the conflict until October, as we've discussed, were primarily focused on targets related to the military or the economy. They struck training areas, fuel tank farms, arms factories, communications, with these strikes being launched in conjunction with their frontline operations. The Russians were, at least then, attempting to defeat the Ukrainian armed forces in the field. Since then, they have been resoundingly defeated. They've been driven back across the Dnieper, their flagship has been sunk, 100,000 of their men are dead, they have limited food and ammunition, and they've done it all with no real gain beyond territory. And that territory's been severely damaged by heavy fighting in which the local populace resists them with a level of hatred one has to see to believe. The shift in strategy is not a winning countermove. It is, in fact, a symptom of potential strategic defeat. The Russians can't destroy the Ukrainian arms supply, nor can they destroy their logistics network. And the primary reason for that is rather simple, when you think about it. If the Russians bomb the General Dynamics plant in Texas or the Rheinmetall plant in the Ruhr Valley, Russia will cease to exist before 2023. Due to the fact that Ukraine's inventory is mostly of Russian origin, they will eventually have to transition to a primarily NATO-equipped force, as obviously they can't exactly ask the original manufacturers for the new stuff. Though they do seem to have the ability to acquire large amounts of it via strategic transfer to alternate locations. And this transition has steadily begun to take place already. Thus, the primary arms production and logistical network of Ukraine is something the Russians can't attack. Furthermore, the Ukrainian rail network has been receiving extensive support from Poland and Romania, as their road and rail networks are linked, as are parts of their power grid. And speaking about the power grid, they can't shut down power to Ukraine because guess what? Most of Ukraine's power stations are nuclear ones, which means blowing them up will have huge international ramifications and probably kill as many of their own people as the Ukrainians. And so, with all these factors and their defeat in the field, Putin has finally realized that victory may not be possible militarily, and so he has shifted his focus to destroying Ukraine's economic and political integrity, and he has decided to do it by killing its people. Simply put, he can't defeat the Ukrainian military, thus he is now trying to defeat the Ukrainian people themselves. Bomb them, starve them, freeze them, destroy their economy and decrease their living conditions to such an extent that it will make Ukraine unable to function as a state, forcing the political leadership of Ukraine to acquiesce to his demands. But of course, the million-dollar question is, or rather given sanctions and inflation, the 10 trillion ruble question is, can the Russians actually achieve it? Short answer? Most likely no. Long answer? Well, it depends, and it depends on several major factors. The first and foremost one is a case of success versus sustainability. After receiving some of the newer NATO air defense systems and the resupply of their S-300s from former Warsaw Pact partners, Ukraine has managed to get the interception rate up to around 75 to 80%, meaning that the Russians can't get enough ordnance through the enemy's defences to cause critical damage. While they have had success in striking substations, power lines, railway infrastructure and water infrastructure, the damage they've inflicted has been almost completely repaired before the next wave of strikes takes place. In fact, in the cases of the drone strikes, the warhead is so small the damage is usually rectified that same day. Ukrainian line technicians, both power and rail, have been doing an absolutely phenomenal job alongside their air defense colleagues in keeping the key infrastructure up and running. The water supply problem has been a bit more challenging, as these facilities run the added risk of flooding and contamination, especially when you have missiles and rockets landing in them which have all kinds of nasty chemicals in their explosives and propellant. But then again, the Ukrainians have managed to organise water supplies for effective areas via motor and rail transport, or if it's possible, the restoration of the infrastructure. So, that leads to the next question. Can the Russians improve their success rate to inflict enough damage? The answer to that is actually yes, but only on one target at a time, meaning that the rest of the Ukrainian infrastructure network will be restored completely in the time it takes between the massed attacks. Their primary problem is one of numbers, which is weird to say when talking about the Russian way of war, but bear with me. That was a terrible pun, and it wasn't intentional originally, but I'm going to roll with it. No. When attacking a defended target with air-launched cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, or surface-to-surface cruise missiles, Soviet doctrine calls for a multiple regiment attack from multiple directions, heavily supported by electronic warfare and decoy munitions. Now granted, an attack on a US Navy carrier group is much harder than one on a fixed location, both in defences and targeting, but if a target has sufficient forces defending it, which the Ukrainians do, doctrine calls for a concerted effort from at least 3 regiments. To put that in perspective, a Russian long-range aviation regiment usually numbers around 20 aircraft, meaning to hit one target decisively, doctrine calls for around 60 aircraft firing 2 missiles each, supported by electronic warfare and decoys. So in order to get past the Ukrainian air defense while causing the amount of damage required, about half of Russia's entire bomber fleet, all their currently available missile-capable ships, or a combination between the two, will have to fire their entire raid's worth of missiles at just one of the selected targets, simultaneously from multiple directions, to knock it out of action effectively. And it will most likely require a number of their long-range drones as well to run interference, as Russian electronic warfare aircraft can't operate over Ukrainian territory due to the aforementioned heavy air defences that they are trying to counter. Then consider that even if you get past the defences, you still need a critical mass of missiles to hit, and you need them to hit accurately, which again the Russians have been struggling with. So there is a chance that even after all of that effort they could still fail, and given that around 150 missiles seems to be the absolute maximum number Russia can employ per strike right now, the resources expended versus the benefits of success do not correlate. And even then, both historical and current events prove that unless you maintain the pressure on high-value targets, the enemy will more than likely just be able to restore partial functionality very quickly and full functionality within a month, unless you get really lucky or hit it so hard it literally ceases to exist. So if the Russians are only able to mount a mass attack like this once a week against one target, they have to pick either one very unlucky Ukrainian facility or divide their attention between multiple targets and lose their force concentration, bringing us right back to where we started, which then leads us into sustainment. Can the Russians sustain this operational tempo long enough to grind Ukraine down? And here is where the axe falls, in my opinion. The answer to this question is almost certainly no. Russia's bomber fleet is old. Very old. As is their naval fleet, for that matter. What's more, Russian maintenance, as we have seen throughout the entire war, and as we have mentioned at the beginning, is, to put it bluntly, abysmal. After Moskva sank, OSINT sources did a significant amount of digging, while inquiries were made by pro-Russian groups and the Russians themselves. How did this ship, which had such excellent defensive capabilities on paper, fail to defend itself and then suffer a complete collapse of structural integrity as well as their damage control process? The answer was revealed to be, of course, bad leadership and maintenance. The Russians couldn't afford, or willfully ignored, maintenance protocols, resulting in the ship not being a warship, but a death trap. Half their systems didn't work, and the other half of their systems were almost constantly breaking down. And, as stated, given what we've seen throughout the Russian forces in general, I have no reason to believe the other ships in the Black Sea Fleet are any better, especially the old Krivak classes, which makes me dubious of their ability to keep up this operational tempo for an extended period. VLS systems aren't the simplest thing, nor are the sensors and targeting systems on board. But it's not just the Navy. We have seen several instances of mechanical failures among the Russian Air Forces during the conflict, resulting in the loss of the aircraft. And if you think the Russian Navy's maintenance issues are bad, oh boy, do I have news for you about the Air Force. You see, Russian aircraft are renowned for their ruggedness and their raw capability. They can fire big guns, carry big bombs, and go really fast. They can also take lots of damage and still function. All of this is true. However, there are two major downsides to this philosophy. First, you have to build in a lot of tolerance for the various components, which increases weight and also lowers the efficiency of the avionics and the power plant. The other major issue is a running theme. They are Soviet-era designs, which means they are excellent concepts with lots of novel ideas, using far inferior materials and built badly. Sometimes apocalyptically badly. This is not helped by the fact that the advances in digital technology did not reach the Union before its collapse. As such, their high technology capabilities are lackluster, to say the least. Which means everything has to be done in the old school way on these aircraft, with miles and miles of cabling, lots of hydraulics, and even some of the old school valves and vacuum tubes. Don't believe me? Check out the interior of the Tu-95. But in fairness, I don't like using the Bear as an example because the Tu-95, ironically, is probably their most effective bomber in terms of capability versus maintenance versus cost. Unfortunately for the Russians, it's not because it's good. On the contrary, it's a museum piece. Literally. And while it's gotten upgrades, it hasn't gotten anything like the number its contemporary the B-52 has received. No. The reason why the Tu-95 looks good on paper is because its colleagues are an absolute nightmare. The Tu-22M and the Tu-160 are very large, supersonic, variable geometry winged bombers built in the 1980s. So you have 40-year-old airframes with huge afterburning engines and a complex mechanical assembly attached to each wing, which has to have its own backup systems and supporting components to keep running. These aircraft, from a design standpoint, are incredible pieces of engineering. From a maintenance standpoint, they are Dante's Inferno, the 69th circle of damnation. Russian engines are hell, literally. They need to get overhauled very frequently. They use inferior materials and are built to a rougher spec. Now, this is fine for the USSR when you've got a massive economy and lots of countries and lots of cheap labor to help you get that done. Not so for the Russian Federation. But the real killer is the variable geometry wings. These are the bane of existence for any aviation maintainer. On these videos, I tend to get a decent chunk of veterans, so if there are any F-14 or F-111 or even B-1 maintainers in the comments, I'd love for you guys to jump in. But dear God. Now, as I mentioned at the start, I don't have the maintenance figures for the Russian Air Force currently. They definitely don't want to share that information, so I will use Western designs. So in this case, the numbers are probably better than what the Russians are getting. Now, starting off with the darling, the beautiful, my favourite aeroplanes ever, the F-14 Tomcat, usually averaged around 50 maintainer hours per flight. My next true love, the F-111, was worse. Some of the old RAAF guys I've spoken to gave me numbers around the 80 mark near the end of her lifespan. But the worst is, of course, the B-1B. Now, I love the Bone. I love her. She is majestic. But she requires a whopping 150 maintenance hours per flight hour. And in recent years, the US fleet of B-1s has gotten down to 10% operational readiness. 10%! That's 6 aeroplanes. The US Air Force had one of its premier weapon systems down to just 6 airplanes. Do you know how much money and how much personnel the US Air Force has? That's the kind of money and time we're talking here to maintain variable geometry afterburning designs. They are horrific on maintenance hours. Absolute hell. And so you have a force of 120 bombers, 80 of them being these hyper-complicated weapon systems, and you need to operate at least half of them per strike, while using over 100 missiles each time. Between maintenance requirements, munitions expenditure, and the current state of the Russian economy, In my estimate, their ability to replace their equipment losses and replenish their ammo are nowhere near up to the requirements to maintain this offensive. I give them until the end of February at the latest before they start relying exclusively on small-scale strikes in their long-range drones. Now, all of this seems silly. It seems like an act of desperation, and to an extent it is. But it's now finally time to bring us back to the historical parallel with the Allied bombing campaign against Germany. When you look at the results achieved against the Reich's industries, populations, and overall warfighting capacity, the numbers are not very appealing. The Butt Report was a report issued early on in World War II which analysed RAF night bombing raids against Germany, a similarly desperate retaliatory measure, at least initially. What they found was that accuracy was low and material impact on the German economy negligible. When the Americans attacked by day, they achieved better results initially, however they still weren't decisive results. Germany's industries kept running, and in fact they increased in efficiency as the war progressed. Worse still, in the initial stages of the combined bomber offensive, both the United States Army Air Force and the RAF had to face completely intact German defences, with almost no protection of their own. In a raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 8th Air Force lost over 60 four-engine bombers, with 10 men inside each one, numbering around 13% of the force. Bomber Command, meanwhile, was suffering through radar-directed night fighters and flak, resulting in them having the highest loss percentage of all the Commonwealth forces throughout the entirety of World War II. However, every single aircraft, flak gun, fire engine, searchlight, and all of the crews required were one less that could be used on the front lines against the Russians, and later the D-Day landings and the landings in Sicily, etc. And as brutal as the losses for the Allied air forces were, as time went on, the Allies slowly leveled the playing field, and upon the introduction of the night fighter Mosquitoes and the P-51 Mustang long-range escort, the bombers were no longer the primary mission. If they blew up some factories, that was great, but the point is, by flying these sorties, the enemy have to engage us, and we have both numerical and material superiority. By waging the air campaign, while the damage to the infrastructure itself wasn't significant, or at least decisive, the damage inflicted to the air defense was devastating. That is the one area where the Russians have a chance. They are throwing so much ordnance at Ukraine so regularly that they are forced to engage the oncoming threats. In doing so, they are expending ammunition from their SAMs and flight hours on their fighters. They are shooting down 80% of incoming missiles, but that means they are almost certainly spending 100 air defense missiles of their own to do it. And given the production facilities for a lot of their SAM systems are all in Russia, they could very quickly run out of the resources needed to counter the cruise missile threat. And with that, the Russians could have an opportunity to make a play for air superiority once more. If they could achieve it, that would allow them to bring their multi-role fighters back into play, which would drastically change the game, and finally give them the strike capacity to actually make their strategic bombing offensive work. So, is this likely? If you'd asked in October, I'd say maybe. Ask me today, no. In a move that has wrecked the Kremlin's plans, the United States and NATO have already committed to Ukraine that they will provide advanced air defense systems to protect their cities from attack, as well as the ammunition to run them. NASAMS is already in play, as is IRST. But the most significant news is that as of last week, the Biden administration confirmed that they are finalizing plans to deploy Patriot to Ukraine. If these deployments go through successfully, which from undisclosed sources I have heard that it's already started, then this aspect of the offensive falls apart. And not only does it fall apart in this aspect, Patriot is quite possibly the most terrifying missile system in the world besides Aegis. Most of it is classified, but the newer versions of Patriot are rumoured to have a track-wall scan capability, meaning that the missile can be data-link guided and then go active on its own when it's close to the target, meaning that a Russian aircraft being intercepted by Patriot would get little to no warning. If the Ukrainians are able to get advanced air defenses, if they are able to replenish it efficiently, and if they continue fighting the way they've been fighting, Russia's strategic bombing campaign is doomed. Especially since the Ukrainians have started counter-air operations against their bomber bases. Yes, you've heard that correctly. Several Russian bombers have been damaged by Ukrainian drone strikes launched at Engels 1 and Diaglievo, both of their main heavy bomber bases located over 500 kilometers or 300 miles inside Russia. It spooked long-range aviation command to the extent that they are now using wartime combat dispersion on their airfields in case of further attack, complicating their already tenuous operational timeframe for maintenance and ordnance deployment, etc. Ultimately, as much as they'd like to think themselves capable of deeds similar to Arthur Blitz the Fritz Harris or the legendary Curtis Peace is my profession LeMay, they had far more available to them in terms of resources and talent. But more than that, they had the ability to control the airspace, to hit targets repeatedly and at will. They were able to effectively and efficiently destroy important targets, both strategic and tactical, and they were able to do it because the enemy air force was destroyed, and they had the time and the equipment to just keep pummeling the same targets over and over again. That is what led to the success of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. Putin's forces just don't have anything like the force required to achieve the same goal. They don't have the aircraft, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the men, they don't have the training. There's just nothing they can do to degrade Ukraine's ability to counter them. The only thing they can really hope to do is break Ukraine's morale. Yeah, nah.